Hello and welcome to our next lecture on the Mount of Olives. I'm Dr. Brennan Roach, the founder of ACTS, and this is a virtual tour of the Holy Land, the Mount of Olives, the place of fruitfulness. Well, some of you may have been following me on Facebook and noticed that I wasn't around for a few weeks and sort of wondering what was going on. And John was doing a great job filling in for me. Thanks, Dr. John, for doing such a great job. But I was out walking on the Camino, which is an ancient pilgrimage to the traditional home of the bones of St. Mark. I don't think they're actually the bones of St. Mark, but we actually use that of St. James, sorry, and we actually use that as an opportunity to do a devotional on the whole book of James. So if you'd like to have a look at that, it's not a video recording, it's a Facebook and some posts and some pictures of different places, and I share a little bit about the book of James over a period of about 2-3 weeks. So enjoy that, have a look at that. You'll find us down here at my Facebook page, Brennan Roach Acts, and or you can go and have a bit of a look at that here. So let's get into what we're doing tonight. We're actually having a look at the Mount of Olives. By the way, that's where I got the whiskers from. Grew the beard out a little bit on the Camino, and I have kept it there as well. So tonight we're actually going to be having a look at some of the events that happened on the Mount of Olives or close by. It was a place where the disciples would stay before they visited the Temple of Jerusalem. We've got a lot of photos and images that I want to show you tonight, and we'll have a bit of a look there, and we can see that's the view from the Mount of Olives. It's a magnificent place that you can go visit if you ever do have the great opportunity to be able to go there in the Holy Land. So it's a place where the disciples would stay before they visited the Temple of Jerusalem. From here, we overlook the Temple Mount. So this is us actually standing on the top of the Mount of Olives, looking back, and you can see the Dome of the Rock there. You can see the Temple Mount. The Dome of the Rock is the golden dome in the middle of the Temple Mount there. You can see, if you look down to the left of screen, you can see the city of David, where King David lived in that part. This is around the time of Jesus, where we can see in the middle, and then you can also see the roads and the modern city of Jerusalem in the background. So the Mount of Olives was what I call the place of fruitfulness. And so we'll have a little bit of a look at that. We'll talk a little bit about that, and we will see that as we continue on with what we're doing tonight. So let's review our journey so far. We started on Mount Nebo, which was the place of promise. We then went down the hill to Sodom, which was the place of righteousness. And then we came to the Jordan River, which was the place of cleansing. We crossed over the Jordan River and we went to Jericho, which was the place of spiritual victory. Then we walked up Wadi Kelt, which was the place of revelation and inspiration. And last time we finished at the Inn of the Good Samaritan, the place of no excuses. So go back and you can have a look. We've got them all on YouTube if you want to have a look there, or go back on the Facebook page, on the Acts page, or on my page, and you'll see the previous broadcast and have a look at those lessons if you want. So we're now in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is the place of worship to God. People have been on pilgrimage. They've been walking there. It's been exciting. Some of them, Jesus would have been 7 to 10 days journey, but some people have traveled from the outer reaches of the Jewish diaspora, and they might have taken 3 months to get there. They might have come from Africa or modern day South Sudan. They might have come all the way from England or Spain or France or Germany, or they could have come from all the way across to what we know as modern day Iraq and Iran. So they're traveling there. They're very excited. They're tired, but they finally get to the Mount of Olives as they start to journey into the place of Jerusalem. So it's exciting. They can see the temple, and it's an absolutely magnificent place that they can go and have a look. So let's have a look at our journey so far. We started up here in Mount Nebo, down to Sodom, crossed the River Jordan, and then we went along the Wadi Kelt, and then we move up to Jerusalem that we can see there. So that's exciting. So now we see where we are. We find ourselves here looking. That's a bit of a closer look. You can see we're just very, very close to the Temple Mount there. You can see the base of the Herodian walls and the walls that surround the Temple of Jerusalem, which go back to the time of Jesus. And we can see the Mount of Olives overlooks the Temple Mount and the city of Jerusalem itself. Right in that foreground there of that view, you can see what was a cemetery that was put in during the Muslim period, and we might talk a little bit about that later. So in the time of Jesus, the Holy of Holies was located where the Dome of the Rock is. So that's the building with the golden dome on it, and that's the rock where, to give you a bit of an idea, where Abraham bound Isaac. It was a place of ritual sacrifice throughout the ages. So this is the place that we believe that the temple was also located on, and in particular, the actual Holy of Holies was located right there as well. So as you can see from this location, you can see everything that actually happens inside the temple. You're actually looking over and down with a slightly elevated view into the temple. And some people would actually say that you could actually see right into the Holy of Holies, as the temple was located in that particular geographic sort of location. You could see right in there. So let's now have a look at a bit of a map of the city of Jerusalem. And it's a fairly simple map that I've got for you here. I don't want to get too many details, but this again is in the time of Jesus. If you have a look on the right-hand side of the map, you can see the Garden of Gethsemane there. You can see the Mount of Olives located. You can see also the temple, and you can see some different pools. You could see Herod's palace, and you could see what's known as Golgotha and Gordon's Calvary, that being the traditional and other locations of the potential crucifixion, which we'll go into in another lesson. We'll have a look at those things specifically. We see the Kidron Valley, which is a deep valley, which runs in between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. So you've got a fairly steep up and down little journey that you need to make to go into the Temple Mount itself. So this is the location walking down during the triumphal entry. It's also when Jesus was coming back from Bethany and Lazarus' place. It's also the mountain where we have the second coming of Christ will occur. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. So hopefully this map gives you a good idea of the basics of Jerusalem, an overview. We can see how looking from the Mount of Olives, you look directly into the Holy of Holies. It's called the Mount of Olives because it is covered. It was in the time of Jesus, it was covered by olive trees. So think about the Garden of Gethsemane, and it was commonplace. You can see in this slide a few trees and maybe some remnants of not some remnants, but some more olive trees. But it's been taken over, that whole area there, which is now a graveyard. That whole mountain was covered in olives. So think about the night of before, when Jesus was arrested, that he was sleeping there, or trying to pray, sorry. But that was the places where the apostles would sleep, the disciples would sleep before they came into the Temple Mount on their pilgrimage. You know, if like me, if you're a Melbourne boy, you don't plan to sleep outside. But let me tell you, in Jerusalem, you can plan to sleep outside and know you're not going to be rained on. Certain times of the year, for months of the year, there is absolutely no rain. And you can be guaranteed to be able to sleep outside and be comfortable, particularly in those more summer nights and summer locations. So we have the view. This is now the view of the Temple Mount looking back towards the Mount of Olives. Here we can see the thousands of graves that are located in what we call the Kidron Valley. These graves actually go back thousands of years. In Jewish tradition, the Messiah will descend from the Mount of Olives on Judgment Day and enter Jerusalem through the Golden Gate. Now that gate has been blocked up and is the center of the eastern wall of the Temple Mount, also known as the Gate of Mercy or the Beautiful Gate. And we've certainly heard scriptures talk about that. Now, Zechariah prophesied that in the final victory forces of good over evil, the Lord of hosts would stand on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives would be split in two from east to west. We see that in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 3 and 4. Ezekiel talks about this as the valley of dry bones. So we've all heard a sermon about that. And if you haven't, just go to Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones. And you can see there in the valley of dry bones, this is exactly the reason why. Now, the reason why Kidron Valley was where the graves were kept is because the prevailing wind would blow the smell of the dead bodies away from the city. So this is why this was the most popular location. Now, for this reason, that being that this is a place where Messiah is going to come, the Jews have always thought to be buried on the Mount of Olives. And it serves as one of Jerusalem's main cemeteries even today. And it's estimated that there are over 150,000 burials that have been done in the Kidron Valley. So let's have a look at the next slide. We see now we've got a close-up of the beautiful gate. And the beautiful gate is covered with tombs to stop Messiah coming in. So why? If you can see in the middle of the photo there, you can have a good look at it. You can see a double gate there. Now, if you look down towards the bottom of those double gates, this wall is actually from a later period, but it's built directly on top of another gate. And there was actually some people walking around exploring on this area, and they actually fell through. It's one of those very contentious areas because directly around, and they fell through because just one of the graves broke open. They fell through as they were looking around, and they found the remains of the actual gate from the Roman period under this here. So during the Muslim period, what they did is the Muslims put graves across the front of the gate so that Messiah could not enter. Why? Because Messiah could not come through a graveyard and enter into the temple and be unclean. Because if you were to touch a dead body, remember we talked about that with the Good Samaritan, if you were to touch a dead body, you would be unclean. So they thought the way to stop prophecy coming to pass was to actually stop this from happening. So they actually put some graves across the front of the beautiful gate. And we can also see that from the Mount of Olives. Here's another picture for us today. There are several churches which we can see as from the top of the Mount of Olives, and you can see the golden domes there. You can see a few small images. You can see the Church of All Nations right at the front there. So we go from the grave sites at the top of the Mount of Olives, and we make our way down, and we walk down, and there's many churches that have been built in that area over thousands of years so that we could, as a pilgrim, go through and remember the different sites and the different locations and the different events that happened. So for the Aussies, for anybody listening from Australia, there's a little spot for us, and the Australian church was involved in building the Church of All Nations. So if you have a look in the foreground, you have a look in that foreground around the Church of All Nations, you can see just to the left, that's a 3-arch building that you can see towards the front, right on the roadside. On the left-hand side of that, on the photo, you can see some what you might not realize is olive trees. And those olive trees date right back to the time of Jesus. So it's a pretty amazing sight. And then you can see the wall built there, and it's dropping down with even some more graves as you continue on into the Kidron Valley. Let's have it our next slide. This is looking back the opposite way from the Church of All Nations. And we now see more olive trees. These olive trees is a modern olive grove, and you might be able to see in the photo there, around about in the middle on the left-hand side, you can see what looks like a pointy tomb. That tomb goes back thousands of years before the time of Christ. And so around this area is what we call some monumental tombs, which we find here. So these are modern day plantings, and they've gone in, they've cleaned up this area, made it into a nice little park where you can then walk down through the Kidron Valley, which is nice if you have the time to be able to do that as well. Now we go back to the ancient olive trees, which are located next to the Church of All Nations. Now, if you know about olive trees, they can have a look at this one on the right here. They can live for thousands and thousands of years. So this olive tree is estimated. The only way you can know is to cut the thing down. Of course, they're not going to do that, and we don't want them to do that. So the olive tree goes back at least 2,000 years, and very much to the time of Jesus. So these are ancient olive trees which are around, and you can cross over the road that we can see in the background here, and there's a large olive grove with many of these trees that are located there, going right back to the Roman occupation of Jerusalem. So we know that they're at least that old. So isn't that amazing? Some ancient olive trees that you can go and see in the Church of All Nations that's 2,000 years old. So let's go back and have another look at our map of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives is located on the east, or as you view it from the right-hand side, Jerusalem, we go down to the Garden of Gethsemane, we go across the Kidron Valley, and we end up in the Temple Mount. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of where we are. But when? Well, there really is no when for Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was the place of the binding of Isaac, which occurred around 1800 BC, and there's even some inhabitants of some small villages and remains that were even before that period of time. But from the biblical character's point of time, from about 1800 BC, Jerusalem was a place that was conquered by King David around 1000 BC. And Jerusalem was a place of the prophets, the priests, and all the kings, and the kings of the Old Testament, and also those of the southern tribe, in particular of Judah. So Jerusalem was frequented by Jesus and all the apostles of the New Testament until Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And when we say destroyed, it was completely destroyed. The Romans were so upset with the revolt of the Jews that had been happening a few times. They literally tore the temple apart brick by brick, and they actually went and plowed the whole city to the ground and actually then built another city on top of that. So when we actually go and visit Jerusalem today, really the only remains we can see is that's under the ground, like around the Temple Mount and Hezekiah's tunnel and different and the Western Tunnel tour, I should say, that's along the wall, and we can see some of the paving of the time of Jesus, and we can see the actual Western Wall, which is part of the Herodian remains. But all the buildings were literally torn apart, and Jesus, of course, prophesied that the temple would be destroyed in 3 days. Why? Because it was full of gold. The Romans burnt it to the ground, and then all the gold melted, went through all the rocks, and the Romans literally waited, pulled it apart piece by piece so they could actually get the gold out. So it's amazing how the prophecies come to pass. So what happened here? We're going to focus on the New Testament in this lesson. However, dozens of biblical events happen here on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. We've got the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Luke chapter 19. And he prayed there with the disciples on the night before he was arrested in Matthew 26 in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's the place of the second coming. It's the place where Messiah is prophesied to come. It's walking with Lazarus from Bethany just over the hill a few kilometers away after he was raised from the dead. And it's where Jesus ascended into heaven from the Mount of Olives on Acts chapter 1. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on what appears to be on the surface a fairly unimportant story by Jesus about a fig tree. So why are we focusing on a fig tree? Good question. So here we see again, we see in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is around that particular location where we see what was actually occurring. So now we have an image of a fig tree. This is a native fig that's found in Israel. And again, there was obviously figs that were on the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane meaning the oil press or the pressing of oil. So that's very apt. And one day we might do a specific lesson on that. But we're going to actually talk about the lesson of the fig tree, which is quite amazing. It's quite incredible that this little story just means a lot. So welcome, Milton, and good to see that you're on board. Feel free to make comments or ask questions. One of our ACT students, Milton, great to have you with us today. So we can see here that we've got a fig tree, and we were talking about the fig tree. And when we're going to look at the story of the fig tree, I prefer to use Mark's version of this story because Jesus is trying to make a point which is much clearer in Mark's version of what's actually occurring there. So let's have a look at that. We're going to read the scripture, Mark chapter 11, verse 12. The next morning, as they were leaving for Bethany, Jesus was hungry. He noticed a fig tree in full leaf a little way off. So he went over to see if he could find any figs. But there were only leaves because it was too early. It was too early in the season for fruit. Then Jesus said to the fig tree, "May no one eat of your fruit again." And the disciples heard this. And so they continue on. Then the next part of the story is Jesus goes down and clears the temple. When they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive the people out who were buying and selling animals for sacrifice. He knocked over the tables and the money changers and the chairs of all those selling doves. And he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. He said to them, "The scriptures declare my temple will be a place of house of prayer for all the nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." When the leading priests and the teachers of the religious law heard that Jesus had done this, they began planning on how they would kill him because they were afraid of him because the people were so amazed at his teaching. That evening, Jesus and the disciples left the city. The next morning, as they passed by the fig tree he had cursed, the disciples noticed it had withered from the roots up. People remembered what Jesus said to the fig tree on the previous day and exclaimed, "Look, Rabbi, the fig tree you cursed has withered up and died." Then Jesus said to the disciples, "Have faith in God. I tell you the truth. You can say to this mountain, 'May you be lifted up and thrown into the sea,' and it will happen. But you must really believe it will happen and have no doubt in your heart. I tell you, you can pray for anything, and if you believe that you receive it, it will be yours. But when you are praying, first forgive anyone you are holding a grudge against, so that your Father in heaven will forgive your sins too." So it fits into that. We sort of we don't focus on the idea of the fig tree because we're more interested in Jesus overturning the money changers tables and that sort of part of the story, which is a really interesting and fascinating part of the story. But it's bookended by the idea of the fig tree. So we're going to have a look at this. So the cursing of the fig tree is really one of the most curious events of Jesus' ministry. What is it? What's he got against fig trees? What's a fig tree ever done to him? What's a fig tree ever done to anybody that it deserves to be cursed? So Jesus is walking to Jerusalem, gets hungry, goes to the fig tree, finds no figs on the tree when it is not the season for fruit. Wasn't even the season for fruit. So he curses the fig tree and it dies. So what do we make of this Jesus? Is he a tree killer? Has he got something against figs? Is he just a random person who's out there killing like a child who's going and stealing fruit out of an orchard? Does he become irrational when he gets hungry? What did this poor tree do to encounter such a fate? This is a curious story all about being fit for purpose. A fig must produce fruit in season. The tree that does not produce fruit in season has no purpose. The fig tree that Jesus was walking towards had a spectacular and beautiful background. So now, hopefully, you're getting the image from what we talked about at the start. Walking down the Mount of Olives, coming up to a fig tree, looking in the background is the temple, the most spectacular sight you can imagine. A beautiful white stone covered had golden spears and elements to it. So you'd see the gold glittering, you'd see the beautiful white stone, And even in some of the doorways and some of the other parts, you'd see jewels that were encrusted, and in sunlight it'd be flickering. So it would be an unbelievable sight. Even if you go to Jerusalem today, with all the white stone in the middle of summer, you need to be wearing sunglasses because the reflection of the white stone in the modern city of Jerusalem, for someone like me, is just too difficult to look into because it makes the reflection so bright. So you take that into in the ancient world, you've got this huge structure, gold, jewels, beautiful white stone, the sun reflecting on it. And so what Jesus is actually talking about is not actually the fig tree, he's actually talking about the temple. So what Jesus is actually saying is that the temple must produce fruit. So what are the lessons that we can learn from what Jesus is teaching here us today? That is, he has two clear lessons that we can be taught. So God has designed each and every one of us to be fruitful. In fact, to be fruitful and multiply according to Genesis 1. So if you're not fruitful, you can't multiply. And that's why the Ethiopian eunuch was seen as a disgrace, and the eunuchs universally was seen as a disgrace in the Bible because they intentionally had decided that they weren't going to multiply. So God had designed each and every one of us to be fruitful and multiply. And so it was important that the temple also would be fruitful and represent God. So the second thing that we learned, that a building of itself is not worthy of God, no matter how ornate and how spectacular that building is, no how much gold is in there, no matter how beautiful it looks, nothing. So we want to have beautiful buildings. We want to have a place to worship God, but it's actually not the building that matters. It's the worship that is contained within the building. So what would happen in that time, that the temple had not become a place of worship for God, but it become a marketplace. It become a place where the priests were ripping off people who were coming on pilgrimage all this way to worship God. So the world is expert at making things look beautiful on the outside. That's what architects do. That's what designers do. That's what image people do. They make things look beautiful on the outside. But what Jesus is actually teaching is something must be fit for purpose. So if a temple is made to worship God, then it must contain worship to God. So first of all, let's surpass the work and be beautiful on the inside, and let the beauty and fruitfulness that's on the inside of us shine out. Let what happens in our church shine out into our local community. Let it first blossom, then bear fruit, then ripen, and then multiply. So that's what this story is all about being fruitful. Fig tree must be fruitful. If you're not fruitful, then you're not productive. If you're a great tree that was like the cedars of Lebanon to produce timber, then you don't need to be fruitful, but you got to produce timber. Whatever your purpose is, if you're a temple, worship to God, you better have worship to God. If you're a local church, you better have praise and worship to God. What's continuing on that? And what you are built to be, then you need to have that. That's why I call the Mount of Olives the place of fruitfulness. So that finishes our lesson for today. That's part of our journey on to the Mount of Olives. Hopefully you'll come back and join us next time. I'm Dr. Brennan Roach, and this has been a virtual tour of the Holy Land. And today we have visited the Mount of Olives. God bless you. Love you. Bye-bye.